Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome you to our breakfast this morning, sponsored by COVISINT. And we're going to be talking today about security issues with co-venturers. As oil and gas projects get more complex, companies increasingly are turning to partners to share the cost and add additional technical expertise. But managing these relationships can be very challenging. Recent security breaches and the spreading use of mobile devices leads to concerns about who has access to what information and when. Today we're going to hear from three industry experts about exploring effective communication and collaboration techniques between joint venture partners, methods of managing identities for external members, and best practice implementations of capital project management with recommendations and next steps. Our format this morning will be three presentations followed by a question and answer session. We have a microphone here in the front of the room. If you have a question, feel free to step up and ask, and we'll do our best to answer. Right now, I would like to invite Kevin Campman to the podium.
Good morning. Let me introduce myself. My name is Kevin Campman. I'm a senior director with Gartner's Security and Risk Management Consulting Organization. I have been with Gartner and a predecessor company that Gartner acquired called Burton Group for about 15 years now. And identity and security issues have been the focus of my career. So what I want to talk about this morning is some of the issues around mobility that organizations face to set the stage for the conversation that my fellow panelists are going to discuss from their industry perspective. The world is changing very quickly. How many of you have mobile devices here? How many of you have more than one? Somebody offered to carry my briefcase in, and he picked it up and he goes, "Boy, you travel heavy." And I said, "Yeah, that's all the computer gear that I'm carrying, because I got to have a company laptop, I've got my iPad, which I prefer to use, and then I've got the phone, and then I've got all the associated paraphernalia that goes along with that, like the cables and so forth." When you're on the road, you pretty much pack up to bring all this along, and you don't appreciate all the extra things that you're carrying around. But away from the physical impact on the individuals, there are a number of forces converging that are changing the way that we look at interactions with other people, other individuals, our supply chain, our joint ventures. In fact, the whole idea of who and what our customers are and how they want to interact with us. First of all, there's the dimension of social computing. We are tied to Facebook. We are tied to LinkedIn. We are doing a lot of work. We do a lot of interaction with our peers using collaboration tools, both in our own organization and between organizations. So social has become part and parcel of everything that we do, whether it's business or whether it's something that we do individually in our what's left of our free time. Another aspect of this is mobility. As you've pointed out, if you looked at each other, everybody has at least one device that they're carrying around so that they can be connected. So we're in a world now where we're always on. And this is something that it's the baseline for many of us. There's no getting off the grid anymore. You are usually fully connected. And there's social dimensions to that as well. And in many cases, although we're looking back to the enterprise and saying, well, I'd like to get information to support my job or to support something I have to do, we're more and more moving that information away from the traditional boundaries of the enterprise and moving that into something called the cloud. And the cloud is a big disruptor because it's making us rethink what information and what capabilities we're willing to move outside the boundaries of the enterprise, and which of those we're willing to accept from others. So it really forces us to start to refactor our relationship with the organization and the others that we deal with. And finally, there's the nature of information is changing. We have, I don't know, there's probably going to be hundreds of gigabytes and terabytes of information that each of us has some interest in or control over. This is phenomenal in terms of the life of the computers, of the world of computers. You know, in terms of the more than, you know, the exponential growth of information about people, about resources, and so forth that we have access to and that we want to take advantage of. At the center of all this is you. All these forces are converging on individuals rather than on the enterprise. The idea of the enterprise systems and so forth is changing. Our behavior, the way in which we or you want to interact with the enterprise and with other organizations and other people that you deal with, is at the center of all of this exchange of these converging forces. So if you're really on top of this, these are new business opportunities. Look at the growth that's taking place in terms of organizations that are learning how to refactor information or provide web singles or mobile single sign-on into these environments. This is changing the nature of the way business is conducted today. How many of you have bought something online? Not everybody, but it's the way we do things now. So it's changing the way that we think. You know, we don't necessarily go to the mall all the time. We go to a virtual mall and do our Christmas shopping that way. When you travel a lot, it's the only way you can get things done. You don't want to carry it around. And it's changing our view of what IT is. And the traditional enterprise model or the enterprise control structure that used to exist. Some of that's still there, but it's really being challenged in terms of perspectives. And this is all about context, because we're more holistic in terms of our relationships with each other and other enterprises, that it's what I want that matters. Mobility is very closely tied to that relationship that I have or that I choose to have with different organizations. Again, the enterprise isn't the focus of that anymore. You're there to serve, not to control. And so we have to take into account when they want to work. There's not a lot of new college graduates here, but my sons are good examples of this. They're in that mobile community. You can't get them away from their mobile devices, and they're usually on them at night when I'm trying to get some sleep. Hear them out talking about what's going on Facebook and the Cisco networking forums and things like that, because they're geeks. But anyway, it's the rate of change that's taking place that we're driving, and the next generations of information consumers are driving, that are changing, that are forcing these changes. So we have this notion that with these mobile devices, behind there's a personal cloud of information that you elect to construct and use. And in that cloud, we have the influence of consumerization, who you want to buy from or interact with, what you're doing with the enterprise or other enterprises. The whole idea of virtualization. How can we push applications from the enterprise down to these devices. And then the whole notion of apps. I just want to pick and choose something that allows me to do what I want to do or need to do and put it on this device. So apps are very topic specific. I need my boarding passes. I click on an airline's application. It knows information about me. It can give me that information. I don't have to print a piece of paper anymore. This is very consumer centric. And there's lots of efficiencies that savvy enterprises can take advantage of that. And it's not just one device. We all have more than one device that we deal with based on the context in which we're operating. In our business context, we may have a laptop or a tablet. In our personal context, it may be the phone, or it may be a combination of those. So it's not one view of computing devices, it's the context in which those devices are used that are driving that experience. So we have multiple channels that we have to deal with to support what we want. So the idea of control has changed. It's all about me. And it's the intersection of the things I want that make me most effective or satisfy my interests. There's an aspect of this of the mobility equation that starts to come into play. These are actually two-way devices, and it's not just the smartphone, it's not just the tablet, it's not just the PC. It's your automobile, for example. That's a trackable device. We're starting to see devices turn up in animals on their collars, so that if our dog gets away, we can find them. We can even give devices to our children to see where they're at. So if they're not at the library and they're at the mall, we can find that out. So this is becoming very, very pervasive, and there are application developers who are doing a lot of work around this to help monetize these capabilities. And this is called geolocation. It's the ability to locate a device or identify the location of a device in real time, and in some cases associate that with the holder of that device. It has influences in two areas. One is the area of access control. We're starting to use these, you heard me mention apps, for example. Organizations who are producing consumer, or making consumer resources available, are associating me with the devices that I carry. And based on pattern analysis, they're able to tell, yes, in fact, that's him, either in his real job or in his personal life. They start to keep track of this because you're being monitored, and that can be used for authentication and authorization purposes. Is the pattern right? Then what we know about this device in the past, this profile that we're developing about this user, that can be used to determine whether or not we're dealing with the person we anticipate that we're dealing with. Some organizations are pushing down old school authentication technologies, but it's really just possession of the device in many cases that's sufficient. There's lots of services associated with this. So for example, I mentioned your vehicle. If you have one of the service mechanisms that tracks the vehicle, there's a profile associated with that. It's really about the vehicle and the family that uses that. but there's characteristics that are recorded about that. So I know that my tires are low. I also know where we drove the car in the last 45 minutes. So if I lock my keys in, I can get them back out by calling somebody. So there's a real upside to that. The downside to this is privacy. I may not want anyone to know where I went in the last 45 minutes. So there's an obligation that comes along with this for organizations who are producing or consuming this information as to how intrusive that is and whether or not that usage is appropriate. So there's not a lot of, I'm not here to give any legal advice, by the way. I'm not an attorney. But you should refer these conversations, if you're involved in this, to your corporate counsel, because there will be regulations and legislation around how that information can be accessed and used. But some of the situations we were talking about last night, insurance companies are now putting devices in cars to determine your driving patterns, to decide whether or not you're a good risk. That's an issue that relates to privacy. How is that information used? How long is it retained? What's the impact on how they profile you relative to others? These are the kind of questions that are going to get more and more attention. So I spend my life, okay, this is the technical part of the presentation. I spend a lot of my life working with something called directory services. Directory services, think of the phone book. That's the traditional view. It's about people, it's about services. And we used to think of this special technology called a directory that looked like a phone book from a logical perspective. And that's what we have here on, okay, now we'll see if the pointer works. There we go, that's this guy, this directory. That's what that symbol is. There's another symbol, that's a database. We can't put everything in a directory, nor do we want to, nor is that appropriate. But there's lots of information that I'm talking about that is coming together in both databases and directories that's being used or can be used to authenticate and authorize people, and also to develop profiles about identities. So what are my preferences? What do I want to keep private? Well, how do I want my information to be used? This is the challenge to enterprises. This is the challenge to communities of interest, is to determine how to bring all of this information together in a virtual manner, because it's not in the enterprise in many cases. A lot of this information is outside of the enterprise. How do we correlate all this information from authoritative sources to provide a virtual view of this social animal we call an identity? Because the game is changing. This is not just about authentication. It's not just about Joe Smith and is he allowed to get on our network and get to his email. It's about what's the long-term relationship we have, what are his preferences, what is his role, what are his roles in the organization? Do we want to track him because he's a service technician, and we need to find out where he's at if there's an event? This is what geolocation can be used for, some of the good side of that. So directory services play a key role in this, collecting and correlating this information and making it available. The traditional directory things would allow us to get to the network. That's authentication. But now in this new world, we have to federate between organizations. So the directory enables us to take attributes out of this environment and sign those attributes, collect them into a package so my organization says, I want this information. You can take this information and send it to that organization and certify that it's good information from authoritative sources. There's still the traditional administration and queries, But this is very important. This is a big change from an authorization standpoint. Pulling that information together requires both the virtual technologies as well as we're dealing with massive amounts of physical information. If we're dealing with consumers, this is where the equation starts to change. You have a 50,000 employee company. Now we're talking about 5 million or 50 million consumers. So the collection and management of that information, and then the interfaces back to, for example, billing systems and service provision systems. Think set-top boxes on TVs. The scale has changed by orders of magnitude. And so we're seeing synchronization technology complementing this to help collect this information and manage it. And we're also concerned about who has access to what. How do they get access to new resources based on their role or based on their request? And then how, over time, do we certify that that's appropriate? So the whole equation around entitlements starts to play with the directory services, whether the entitlements catalog and the policy management is in the directory or not. It relies on this view of an identity to function effectively. So really one of the takeaways from this is that all the money that we're it's always going to be complex. We wouldn't be here to talk to you about simple problems. It's always going to be a complex situation. We've spent the last part of my career dealing with legacy systems, trying to get this information to correlate and not necessarily always being successful in doing that. It was fragile. It broke easily. Sometimes you couldn't even buy technology to do it. You had to write your own. But in the new environment that we're dealing with, we have similar degrees of complexity, but it is there to support very dynamic, externally focused, or externally managed environments. We're pushing a lot of information out to the cloud rather than keeping it in the enterprise. And it's focused on individuals and their interactions with the organization. So we're dealing with more data, faster, in different contexts, and it's really putting, sorry about that, it's really putting a strain on the view of identity to organizations as well as the management of that information between organizations. So some of the considerations that this brings, not all, but some of the considerations that this brings to the table for us. First of all, what are the conditions that this information is being collected for? What are we going to use this for? And is it the right thing to do? This is the opt-in and privacy issue. In many cases, we have these profiles. Everybody in this room has a profile. I can guarantee you. Somebody knows something about you that you don't know. But they know. They know, believe me. All you have to do is start investigating, and you'd be surprised what you can find out about people. Is that being shared and used and monetized in a way that benefits the consumer or the external party or not? Or should they even be a party to the decision? We're talking about orders of magnitude more data. Again, why are we collecting it? How is it being used? And can we afford the resources that it takes to bring that information together? How many of you heard the New York Times story about the father who found out his daughter was pregnant before she knew? Data analytics. And then the biggest issue for many of us is policies and entitlements. We have all this information that we use. What controls do we have in place for who has access to that? what entitlements people can get access to, what's behind those apps that we're trying to use on these devices, what relationships and reputation come into this, and what privileges do we allow in this new distributed mobile environment. So that's my introduction. Let me turn it back over to Rhonda to introduce Dave.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Kevin. That was interesting and fairly frightening presentation. Next, I'd like to invite Dave Miller from COVISINT to give his presentation. Thanks.
So, most of you probably have no idea who COVISINT is. Well, you may know because you actually came here. You either came here because you knew who COVISINT was, or you came here because breakfast was free, or you've never been in this wonderful room. And what I want to do is talk a little bit, to start, a little bit about COVISINT, but what does this all have to do with the oil industry, right? We're kind of talking about this whole changing stuff, and what does it have to do with that? So, COVISINT's kind of the smallest big company you never heard of, right? So we currently manage over 500 global customers. We were born 12 years ago out of the automotive industry who had an issue, right? Which was what we now call an engagement issue, right? So we do this thing called platform of engagement. Now, what does that mean, right? Well, what it means is how is it that you engage with external folks? So in the real world, where you're talking, right, to normal folks, it's how do I engage with my family and my friends, right? In the business world, right, your family and friends are your partners, your suppliers, those sorts of things. In automotive, when we started, the issue happened to be suppliers, right? 45,000 global suppliers, lots of OEMs, right? Basically having to engage, right? And we're seeing kind of the same thing in other industries. So you can see there's a lot of healthcare companies up there, and there's some oil and gas companies. So why is this important? Well, so Kevin here gave me this picture a long time ago. This is the way the oil industry looked when he started in it. And in the early days, it was nothing more than basically brute force and drilling a hole in the ground and putting a straw in it and sucking the oil out. And as it's become more and more difficult to find oil, and as it's become more and more of a challenge to keep up with the pace of our utilization of energy, what has happened is more of this sort of thing, right? So it's not as simple anymore as just drilling a hole in the ground, right? You guys know all this, right? So it's you got big platforms that you have to deal with, right? Oftentimes it's about a lot of IT type of stuff, right? You've got companies like Schlumberger who do a lot of data analytics, right? Where when we talked about size of data, right, one of the things Kevin talked about was this idea, right, that there would be, gigabytes or terabytes of data, right? So for those of you who don't know, right, so you're right, we know what a million is, right? A gigabyte is 1,000 million, right? A terabyte is 1,000 gig, right? And the new thing now is in terabytes. I remember when terabytes was a huge, huge deal, right? So now you talk to some of these organizations, they're talking about petabytes. That's 1,000 gigabytes of information, right? And that's the kind of size of data that we're actually talking about these days, is that sort of thing. So what does this mean, right? Well, the interesting thing here is information is actually starting to become the asset. So it's the reason why we protect it. So it used to be that the asset was the intellectual property, it was the information people had in their head, it was the smarts that they basically had. Right? Now it is the data that they have. So it's the seismic information that you have, so you know exactly where to drill. It's the historical information about stuff. It's the information after you've drilled, basically about pressure levels and all of those things that become the asset. And we know that it's an asset because we protect assets, and we all know what happens when somebody hacks into a system, right? When information gets out, right, your stock price can go down. So in healthcare, there's laws like HIPAA and high-tech types of things. I mean, we protect this information, right? Because information really has kind of become the asset that you have to deal with. The second thing is, and this is something that was interesting, and we've been doing energy now for probably about 5 or 6 years that we've been doing this. And when I first started, what I didn't realize is how collaborative the industry is. So nobody does anything by themselves anymore. So you either have to collaborate with large suppliers, right? So the Halliburtons and Schlumbergers of the world, right? Or you have to collaborate with government agencies because you're going to be drilling someplace that's nationalized, and so you have no choice but to have to collaborate with Saudi Aramco or something like that. So we have 2 things that are going on here, right? Actually, more like 10 things, right? One of them is lots and lots and lots and lots of data. Second thing is the information is becoming really one of the major assets. And the third thing is the information doesn't all sit in one spot because it's collaborative. So if information becomes a competitive differentiator, right? If the way that it works today is there are enough oil companies that are out there that it isn't about your ability to be able to drill, right? It's not about the drill bit because the suppliers supply everyone with the same types of things. Oftentimes it's the information that's the differentiator. It's the ability to know exactly where to drill and how you're going to do it. It's managing that information. It's being able to look at all that information to be able to decide what decisions to be able to make. And again, this whole idea of collaborative architectures, right? So it's back to this idea of I am no longer the master of my domain. I don't do everything. When I started in the automotive industry in the 80s, the push at that time was to bring everything in. So when I started at General Motors owned almost all their own suppliers. So they did their own powertrain, they did their own engines, they did everything except for maybe tires and fasteners. They owned their own IT department because they bought EDS, right? Everything was internal. If you look at the OEMs today, it's all external, right? They buy everything from suppliers, okay? And they do that because it's an efficiency issue. The energy industry is the exact same way, right? So the idea is that you buy data and information from companies like Schlumberger, right, that have seismic information, right, and pressure information, right? You buy the drilling rigs or rent the drilling rigs, right, from organizations like Transocean. You, again, have to communicate and collaborate with government agencies. So again, the information sits in lots and lots of places. So what does this mean, right? Well, we all talk about this. The idea is the way to fix this is this whole idea about the cloud, right? And this is not who we want to end up being, right? So I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of IT, I deal with a lot of IT organizations, and in the IT world, the cloud can oftentimes be this thing that makes them believe that they're losing control. The biggest competitor COVISINT has when we go in to talk about cloud is internal IT. Oh, no. We're doing that just fine. We don't need the cloud to do this because I don't want to give control up, right? I want to do this all on my own. But the problem is that if you take a look at the energy industry, right, the problem is the fact that you basically have joint ventures, right? So if you've got a joint venture, okay, so that's kind of complicated, right? So it's in order to be able to do drilling, I'm going to do a joint venture with 2 organizations. Okay, that's great, and so there's connectivity, right? Unfortunately, the thing is those joint ventures oftentimes are between competitors. So now maybe the joint venture is Shell and Chevron, right? So that joint venture is the 2 of them, right? It's a government agency. So now I've got more complex. Now, the lines aren't complex, but they don't want to share data, right? So it's I've decided I'm going to do, we used to call this co-opetition, all right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to cooperate with you, even though we're in competition. So today, right, we're going to work together, and tomorrow we're going to work as competitors. One of the things that I've heard is on the same drilling rig, this hole is you and me working together, and this hole is you and me not working together, right? It can be that close. But it gets more complicated than that, right? Because it's everybody, right? It's everybody in the industry, right? It's all of your suppliers, right? It's all of your transit, right? So it's not enough that you have to drill it, you have to get it out, you have to ship it somewhere. Someone else may own the pipeline, you have to deal with the pipeline, or you have to deal with the shipping type of area, right? You have to worry about refining it, right? You may not refine it, you may get it out of the ground, and one of your competitors may refine it, and then you may get it back so that you can sell it at one of your gas stations. Then we bring all these cloud applications. So now the new thing is, oh, hold on, it's not just my IT stuff. I'm going to buy all kinds of third-party cloud applications, right? So for my employees and all of this. So I have all of this cloud stuff that I have to deal with, right? I'm going to do things like SharePoint, right? SharePoint's this great cloud application that Microsoft has. It allows us to share all kinds of collaborative information, but it sits in the cloud. I want all of my folks to have access to it. And now, as Kevin said, it's not even about web browsers anymore. So it used to be, at least it was www.something.something, right? But now it's an iPhone app, or it's an iPad app, or it's an Android app. I want to be able to run it on the phone. I want to be able to have it connected to my vehicle. I want it running directly on the wellhead so that actually shows all the information is completely and totally connected. And the problems associated with this are the things that are up top, right? And one of the big issues is visibility. So think about this in your real life. So we've decided that we're going to partner with lots of third parties. We're going to share a whole bunch of information. Now I'm the employee who has to be able to go find all the information because I still have a job to do, right? So visibility in this case means, how do I know every place to go? So how many IDs do I have to get my job done? How many places do I have to go to? How long does it take when you hire someone in? How long does it take to get them set up on every single system that they have to get set up on in order to actually be able to do the job, right, that they have to do, right? As I said before, we have competing organizations, so there's this trust relationship, right? This co-opetition, right? I'm going to trust you in some cases, I'm not going to trust you in others. Compliance becomes a huge issue, right? So we all know, right, that this industry, probably more than others, is watched like a hawk. And so you have to do things the right way. And because it's international, there's all kinds of rules about privacy, auditability. There's things that you can do in the United States that you can't do in Europe, that you may not be able to do in areas like Saudi Arabia when it comes to tracking what users access, information about users. There's the whole technology thing. So now what we've done is again, it used to be, at least I had my own data center. I picked my own technology, and those are the technologies that my company had to be focused on. But now that's not the way it works. Now the way it works is I have my data center, but then I'm connecting to 15 other data centers, and they've all picked other technologies, and some of them are ahead of me on the scale, and some of them are behind me on the scale, so I have to become an expert at everything. Cost is always an issue. So how is it that I can reduce my total cost, right? So IT in general is a cost center, so it's not a profit center, but this information is becoming valuable, but how much is it going to cost me to be able to do this, and can I afford to do this all by myself? Do I want to do that on my own? Change is a huge thing. So now what happens is I pick all of these connections, but they continually change, right? They're continually being updated, right? And then in the end, it's also user experience, right? So user experience, again, is this model that says, so imagine that to get my job done, I've got 10 IDs on 10 different systems, and my user experience is 10 IDs, 10 passwords, or 10 of those little secure ID fob things that I have to hold around my neck type of deal, right? Got to log in 10 different times, right, in order to be able to get the one piece of information that I need to be able to make a decision, right? That's user experience. So one of the things that we've attempted to do is have this idea of, so what if you had an energy ecosystem? This is actually simpler than you think, at least from conceptually, right? The idea, I had a sales guy once who saw this this picture, right, and it was here's this picture and here's this picture, and he said, oh, I get it, less lines is better, right? And that's really kind of the thing, right? It's the hub and spoke model, right? So if you have a network of 10 things, and all 10 things have to communicate with all 10 things, if you go point to point, right, it's 2 to the 10th minus 1, right? So it's lots and lots and lots of connections. If you put something in the middle, it's 10 connections. Everyone connects to the middle, and what you get is this ability to manage some of these things. So the visibility aspect of it is this idea of what's called identity lifecycle management, right? And what that really means is you get to have one ID. You get to be provisioned to every place that you need to go with that one ID by one administrative process, as opposed to 10 administrative processes, right? It makes it simple for you to onboard somebody and get them to the 50 places they need to go. It also makes it easier for you to deal with the second one, which is trust, and actually the third one also, which is compliance, which says, what happens when someone leaves your company? So it's tough enough that it took 3 months for me to get the 30 IDs that I had to have to be able to get to all of this information that we agreed was competitive advantage. But now I've decided I'm going to leave. And most people, when they leave company A to go to company B, they don't actually change job functions, right? Very few people say, I used to be a petroleum engineer, and now I've decided to be a bus driver, right? Normally it's I was a petroleum engineer for company A, and now I'm a petroleum engineer for company B, right? And oh, by the way, the 50 IDs that I had on 50 systems, only 20 of them were gotten rid of. So when I go to my competitor, I'll just keep logging on those IDs, right? What a great way for me to be able to look at all the information, right, that's already there. With a central system, you shut it off in one spot, right? This ability to turn it completely off, right? Again, compliance, right? So we all know how now especially, right, you have to be able to provide audit records and information to the government about every single aspect of every single thing that you do, right? But keep in mind, if you're running the joint venture, all of the information and access you may not own. It may be owned by 5 joint venture partners, right? Having a central spot to have a single audit that says here's everything that happened related to all of the partners, right, makes it a lot simpler for you to be able to provide that information. Technology changes, right? If you give it up to the cloud service, right? So being able to say, I'm going to connect my way, and I don't have to worry about the fact that my supplier has decided that he's not as advanced as me, and so he's going to use the process that was 3 years ago. Or worse, my supplier is way more advanced than me, and he's decided that he's going to do this new cool thing, right? I don't have to worry about that because it's obfuscated because of the central cloud, right? Cost, right? This is the one I'm going to go back to what my sales buddy said, right? Less lines is easier, less lines is better, less lines is cheaper, right? Every single one of these lines is an interface. An interface means you have people who are watching it because it's got to be up, it has to be available. If you have to manage 30 lines, it costs you 30 times more than if you have to manage 1 line. It's actually a fairly straightforward model, right? Again, you're disconnected from all of the change in technology. I've decided that I'm going to pick Microsoft and they're going to be my connectivity technology, and I'm going to do that technology into the cloud, into an engagement platform, and then I don't really care about the fact that other people are changing. I can change at my own pace. And then user experience, I'm back to this idea of, right, one ID, one place to go. You know, one of the things that I always, when I talk to groups that maybe aren't a bunch of IT guys, one of the things that I always talk about is look at your personal life, right? So imagine a world where you had one ID and one password that got you on the internet, that securely got you to everything that you needed. So it got you to Amazon, it got you to eBay, it got you to your web banking site, it got you to your utility site, it got you to everything, and all you had to do is remember one ID and one password. You didn't have to remember 10, you didn't have to log in 10 times. I can't tell you the number of times that I can't remember what my password is for the site that I have to go on once a year. That becomes a huge issue, right? Now, there are things in the B2C world that are solving that. In the B2B world, it's even more important, right? So if I can't remember the ID for my 401k system, I can kind of say, well, that's all right. So I'll try to remember it. I'll call someone. I guess if I look at it tomorrow as opposed to today, it's okay. If I can't remember the ID and password for the data acquisition system that I have to log into right now because my boss said that he needs a report right now, it probably is a little bit bigger a deal from a standpoint of at least what I'm doing, right? And so now what it is I have to have that, so that user experience really kind of becomes important. So that's really kind of what we do, right? So, you know, if you look at kind of what Kevin talked about is the kind of the whole nexus of forces thing that's happening. I try to kind of connect it down into the whole concept of what this means to the energy industry in specifics. But if you think about it, what you've heard from now is an analyst who kind of tells you the way that the world should be, a vendor who's trying to convince you that we have got the most brilliant thing to solve your problem. We thought that it would be a good idea to actually bring a customer up who actually is in the oil industry. So, thank you very much, and there will be time for questions.
This is just a statement, not a question. If you only have one ID
Yeah,
and one password
Yep.
instead of 20,
Yep.
isn't it 20 times more dangerous?
no,
If somebody picks it.
no. And everyone brings this up, right? Everyone's like, well, hold on. At least if I have 20 IDs, if somebody gets my one ID, then they don't have the other 19. But here's the thing that happens. When you have 20 IDs, then you come up with 20 passwords that I guarantee you I can guess, because nobody can remember 20 different passwords. If I give you one ID, then you're probably going to be willing to have this really nice long. If you only had one password to remember, that's all you ever had to remember, you probably say, well, I'll do a nice, long, hard password, because I only have to remember one. I don't have to remember 20, right? So I can actually secure you better by creating a single ID, right? Maybe giving you one of those goofy fobs where you have to type the number in, or SMS text message, right? You ever see these secure ID things, right? The number changes. Every minute the number changes. And that's the number that is your password, right? Every minute it's a different password. Well, if you need 20 of those, that's a pain, because I can't remember which one is the one that I'm supposed to look at. If I have one ID, then what I can do is secure that one spot better, right? You can think of it like doors in a house, right? Or in a bank. So if I have 20 ways to get into the vault, you can say, well, and I can have it compartmentalized, you can say, well, at least if he gets in one spot, he can't steal everything. If I only have one door, I'll just make it really thick and really big, and that is more secure. So,
Thank you.
all right.
So as Dave said, we did actually bring a real-life client today, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Brad Foreman from Shell. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Let me see if I can get this thing. There you go. On your invite, the person who's supposed to be speaking is Adrian Estala. He is the risk architect for Shell. I work for Adrian Estala. I've sat next to him for the past 2 years, so I'm kind of him by osmosis. But since July of 2011, I've managed the external access to SharePoint project, which started out as a twinkle in somebody's eye. When I was given the project, I was given quite a few requirements, and I've condensed those requirements down to these objectives. I was told that I needed to make SharePoint remotely accessible by Shell business partners and customers and joint ventures, as well as the collaboration portals. The second thing that I was told to do was ensure that the user experience was the same for an external user as it is for an internal user. And with the number of users that Shell anticipated bringing onto the SharePoint environment, I was told that we needed to outsource the identity management process, registering users, the authentication help desk to a trusted third party. And then the last objective of the project was to provide a secure solution that could not be hacked and was auditable by Shell internal risk management. So after going through all of the requirements and doing a couple of POCs, we spent a number of months, or the first month of January, working with Microsoft as well. We came up with a solution with these primary components. Here you see the external identity provider, and in that picture, this is COVISINT. We needed them to do user registration, user verification, authentication, as well as two-factor authentication. Because we wanted to secure the applications, we decided to front end them with an authenticating a reverse proxy, and then surround it with an extranet firewall, intrusion protection, as well as other security products around it, and then the application on the back end that you're presenting to your third parties. And I'm going to be much faster than those guys, so I hope you appreciate that. So the functional flow that a user experiences with our solution is this. We have a third-party user who is given a URL to access a SharePoint application. That URL is actually resolves to this reverse proxy. Once it's entered into the browser, that user is redirected to COVISINT, where he enters a user ID and a password. If that's correct, he's sent a one-time password to a mobile device, and upon authentication is redirected to the actual environment. A token is created, is passed through this ADFS environment, and then is authenticated at the SharePoint site that he's authorized for. Any questions about that? It's kind of a busy slide there. All right. So what were the results of our project? We were able to create a complete architecture that presented the internal SharePoint hosted environment to our external partners, as well as the cloud Microsoft 365 environment. And the user experience wasn't much different from the internal environment if you use Internet Explorer. If you used other browsers like Chrome, Safari, there were some differences because IE has ActiveX, and it's meant to integrate better with SharePoint 2010. And we were able to present a secure environment that passed not only an audit that we needed to have against the environment, but we sent hackers after it to see if they could break the environment. So what were the benefits that we got from this environment? Well, since we're anticipating 50,000, 100,000 users to use the external, to use the collaboration portal, we have reduced burden of identity management, because all of that's going to be done by COVISINT. When a user needs to call because they've forgotten their password, COVISINT will answer that call, or they'll go to a self-service site. There are more capabilities now that Shell has to collaborate environments, to collaborate with partners. You can put quite a few applications on top of SharePoint, and now, since that's an auditable service, an enterprise service, it's much, you can much more quickly put an environment in place. And then the last thing, it accelerates the development of other environments. If an application is SAML capable, you can very easily put the solution that we put in place in front of it, so that you can federate it with your business partners. So,
Technology and great, isn't it?
Oh, you gotta carry it around. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks to all of our speakers for your presentations. We do have a roving microphone named Chris Hartnett. If anybody does have any questions, just signal Chris, and he'll be happy to take your questions. Anybody? Don't be shy. All right, I'll kick it off.
Wait,
Oh,
there's a question,
okay.
there's a question over there.
So what kinds of users and what kind of user information gets passed? And, you know, you had the GM case, and I know that's been around for a while, so, you know, how many types of users? In other words, what kind of scale and what kind of information is easily communicated?
So, you know, if you look at our different communities, right, in the automotive space, it is primarily suppliers, right? So those users are global supplier users. But in addition, COVISINT also does OnStar. So OnStar.com is COVISINT. And so in that case, the user information is OnStar users, right? So the actual customers. In our healthcare implementations, it's physicians, right, who are accessing healthcare information. So it's actually matter of fact, Baylor University is the health information exchange that's in this area. That's COVISINT. So my guess is some of your healthcare information that your healthcare providers are accessing ends up going through us. In the case of our energy implementation, right, it is primarily these joint venture partners. So it's folks at Schlumberger, it's folks at Halliburton and Transocean and other places like that. I think Brad can kind of talk to what type of users are using their SharePoint implementation through us.
Well, the initial applications that were on the environment were customers as well as business partners. There was a non-Shell branded site that we put on that were actually other oil companies, and so it's going to be a mixture.
Other questions?
I know that the bring your own device, you know, is becoming a more popular component. I'm sure, Kevin, that you've come into that. What are y'all seeing in terms of how companies are dealing with the idea that you've got certain individual privacy components associated with if I bring my personal, iPad or my phone, but yet I'm going to use that device then also to receive, company email, to be able to look at information, and then, of course, being able to have some sort of corporate backup of that information.
So what we're seeing organizations do, in some, you have to manage this from the standpoint of risk. So most organizations who are looking at BYOD, the first thing you need to do is to establish what kind of information risk is associated with that device, and put some controls in place from a management perspective, as well as a device protection like authentication and so forth. The ability to, if a device is lost, to wipe that device is very important. But the issue around information is, the big question is, you really have to analyze how much information you want on that device at any one time. In many cases, you can use, like with email, for example, it's okay to have to have calendar information. It may be okay to have contact information, but it may not be okay to have a storage of email information. So you have to determine where your risk is with that and how much access you want to allow. As the sensitivity of the information starts to arise, you might look at containerization solutions that basically say we either allow this, but this is the way in which this is managed, or you keep that information back at the enterprise in that environment, so that it doesn't the information doesn't actually reside on the device. And so that's the balance. But it's all you have to tie that off with network capabilities, right? So you have to have the bandwidth, and this is less and less of an issue today. You have to have the bandwidth to enable people to operate in that environment. So it really comes down to an analysis of how the devices are going to be used, what kind of flexibility and capability users require, and what's their obligation to the organization to manage information from a security and information management perspective, so that they understand what their obligations are with respect to BYOD. So, we're seeing a stronger attention to governance, a stronger attention to policy, and taking a better look at information classification from the standpoint of what you allow to go to the device in the first place.
The other thing that's interesting about this, it is kind of changing things, and it's, if you look at where the industry has gone in the last, right, the IT industry in general in the last 30 years, right? So 30 years ago, we were very thin client, if you really think about it, right? So 30 years ago, it was those green screen things, right? Remember those, right? The thing, right? 80 characters, right? 20 rows, green screen, right? Everything ran on the mainframe, which was a big server. And because we just got these PCs, we decided we wanted stuff to be more graphical and move around, and so we moved to this thing called client server, right? So now what I had all these clients, and you had to download the client, it did all kinds of wonderful things. But everybody hated that because you could never keep up to date with it, right? You had to download the new client, right? Everyone had to worry about supporting multiple things. So we went to the web, which, by the way, is nothing more than a graphical green screen. We went back to the mainframe days. It just happened to be a different platform, right? So now it's www something, data stays at the server, right? We have now moved again back to client server, okay? Now what I do is on this phone, I have all these apps, right? And I download these apps, and these apps are the things, and this is where this BYOD becomes problematic, because now the data is stored in this phone, okay? On the web stuff, I may have to worry about caching, but other than that, there's no data on the phone because it's a web interface. It's a thin interface as opposed to a thick interface. But these apps are really causing a huge, huge problem. And so the move, at least that I see is going to happen, is we're going to go back to thin. It's going to be more like HTML5. You won't be able to know what it look. It'll look really cool. Okay, but it's going to be thin again so that you don't care about the phone. The phone becomes, or the mobile device really becomes nothing more than a visualization, and it doesn't actually have to store the information that sits there. And there's a lot of organizations, in healthcare, I can tell you, a lot of organizations are moving towards this web client so they don't have to worry about things like HIPAA compliance and high-tech compliance on PHI data being stored on phones and on mobile devices.
Yeah, so you're going to continue to have that balance between convenience and security in terms of the information, and that's something you'll have to manage.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, and as Rhonda said, frightening in some ways. So from a business supplier in the oil industry, where do you, from a Shell perspective and a COVISINT perspective, see the cost sharing? So if we have to work with Shell, Chevron, BP, whoever, and we have to register this single service provider name, what's the model for that cost sharing?
Well, at Shell, the business unit that wanted the application that you put on top of SharePoint would be responsible for the cost of that ID, since they're the ones that's dealing with the contract of the business partner.
The business partner.
Right. Not in not in how we were doing it.
Yeah. The other thing that we're looking for, and it's a stepwise process, right? And again, we've been lucky enough to have kind of started as a bunch of automotive geeks creating what is really a multi-tenant site, right? So the place to get to is this ability for suppliers in the energy industry to say, I have one ID to an energy ecosystem, okay? And that gets me to everybody, right? Now, that sounds great in practice, right? But in reality, you have to get everyone in a room and you have to get them all to agree to work together. and that takes forever. And so what we see happening is we see individual implementation. So unfortunately, right, there's an implementation for Shell. We have an implementation for Chevron, and those are separate implementations. But what we see them doing is, I think in the long run, they're going to merge. What's going to happen is there's going to be some of this co-opetition saying, you know something, if you already have an ID for the Shell system that gets you to a SharePoint instance, can I use that ID to be able to get to the Chevron SharePoint? And I think in the long run, those things will go together, right? And we've done some work, for example, with Energistics to try to become a central point maybe for that sort of thing. But it's just not there today. In energy, it's just not there today.
I think what you would want in any community of interest is as you look at the hub model, who's in the center, and it's so the question becomes you want to avoid having multiple IDs even in that environment, and so it really comes down to a question of where is it beneficial for you contractually or from an efficiency perspective to manage the identities that are associated with your organization, and as opposed to having multiple identities for multiple applications. So as this starts to scale, you'll realize that it makes more sense for you to retain that control as a supplier over who those identities are. But that requires greater adoption of a strategy to leverage those identities in the community.
Other questions? Well, I do have a question. Some of what you guys are talking about reminds me of the e-commerce boom that happened in the late 90s and early 2000s that I think fizzled because you had to buy into somebody else's idea of what you needed. And once you were locked into that, you were not able to, use multiple suppliers for certain things. At least that's the way it was portrayed within the oil and gas industry. How do you get around that perception when you were pushing this kind of a solution?
Well, so I'll tell you the experience having been part of a fizzled e-commerce group. Which is, by the way, is still COVISINT, right? So I always, when COVISINT started, the OEMs, I came from General Motors, right? They put $500 million into this thing, convinced that if a sock puppet, if everyone remembers Pets.com, right, that had the sock puppet, and the CEO of GM said at the time, if a company that is managed by a sock puppet can be worth $45 billion market capitalization, imagine what we can create something real. And we did this thing, right? We're going to host everything. So we were going to be the portal, we were going to be the ID, we were going to be all the systems, we were going to be the whole e-commerce thing. And the only thing that the three OEMs could agree upon, they all agreed that there should be one way to do it, and they all agreed it should be their way. And so we had 3 inventory systems, and we had 3 purchasing systems, and we had 3 auctioning systems. But what was interesting is the part that was underneath it, the platform part. This is the logging in with a single ID, having a portal visualization so you could see stuff. They all agreed. They were all like, yeah, we don't care about that. Okay, and so what we learned is that maybe you don't have to take over the e-commerce aspect, the application aspect of it, that if you at least take over the platform part so that people can go to one place with one ID, with one authentication, with one workflow, that simplifies. Now, you still may have to deal with 3 different energy companies who've all decided that the way they want to have information presented is different because, again, information is their competitive advantage, but at least you get to go there once, right, with one set of information, maybe even surfaced up. So we're kind of focusing on this lower level platform as opposed to the higher level services.
I think in both Dave's and Brad's conversation, you heard some alphabet soup about standards like SAML, which is a security assertions markup language. The nice thing about standards is there's lots of them, right? So pick yours. The ability to make this work and insulate it from failure is to have the ability to do that translation of standards, so that as you move from this single point of authentication that Dave describes to these different environments, that you pick your route, because the standards, even in that environment, will change. The ability to translate and transfer that is a great way to normalize the communications that are taking place and simplify the operation overall. So the real challenge here is to consider what your business requirements are, and don't mandate a particular technology or solution to get there, but understand what your goals and what your risks are and how you manage those, and then be able to use the right technology at the time to enable that. I think that's a lot of the things we're talking about as standards are still work in process. And they're solving different use cases. And so you really have to look at this from the standpoint of what you need as an organization to make this effective, and make sure that the suppliers you select can continue to support that as those needs change.
Okay. Are there any more questions out there? You know everything now, huh? Yeah. All right, I just...
Anyone? Bueller? Bueller?
I'm just going to ask you guys one more question then. The word change has been coming up an awful lot during your presentations. Can you look into the future or crystal ball a little bit and kind of identify where you see this kind of technology going in the future?
We got to end with the analyst. He's going to be the real change guy.
Well, I'm the technology guy. I look at the present. But my solution was a tactical solution that was to present SharePoint to third parties. Going forward, I think a solution that only deals with the external parties is not going to be the way to go. It will be one like Dave described, that aggregates all the users in one central hub, so that applications can use that for authentication. So that's the change I see going forward.
I think, are you ready to end with the analyst?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
No, my turn.
oh, you want to take
Then
it?
you go.
Go ahead.
Right, because I'm going to propose something that's really a bit kind of out there, right? So if you take a look at the history of electricity, right, in the very, very early days, right, every single hotel in New York City had its own electrical plant, right? Electricity was something that you created on your own for the purpose of using it in your own building, right? And today people would look at that and say, it's the dumbest thing ever. Why would you do that? It's unbelievably inefficient, right? In 30 years, people are going to look back, and someone is going to be on a panel saying, in the old days, everyone had their own IT departments, and they actually ran their own computers. And people are going to say, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard in the world. Why wouldn't you just use IT utilities to be able to do this? This cloud thing is going to become everything. There's not going to be an IT department. IT is going to be processes that are run in the cloud, and they're going to be purchased by business. And you're going to buy it the same way you buy your electricity and the same way you buy your water. And services like COVISINT that aggregate stuff, it'll just happen, right? There won't be a presentation on, well, you only have one ID. It's like, yeah, no, duh, I only have one ID. Why would I have more than one? I think that's really where the future is going to end up being.
And I really want to second that in terms of the commodities. We're going to be facing more commoditization as we standardize on different capabilities and services and focus on consumerization. In other words, what people want to buy. They want to. People are looking for simple, fast solutions, and so the idea of a complex environment is, I do believe that will still exist to some extent, but on the other hand, the ability to normalize and shift the weight of control around information and services to the people who are paying for it. We'll be moving away from this you owning that environment to using services to help you manage it in standard and flexible ways. So I would expect to see more consumerization, and I would expect to see greater flexibility in terms of how these services and solutions are marketed and provided for us to enable. So, you know, I think I agree. The cloud is going to be there for us for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Well, that concludes our presentation. We'd like to thank all of you for coming and enjoying our free breakfast and listening to our speakers. Thank you very much.